My name is Mark Pulowski, and I'm here on the behalf of WebAge Solutions Training Company, giving this webinar on using React hooks. The beginning part of this, we're going to go through some topics and probably bring up the code as we're doing it. So this is the overview of what we'll be going over. First, we just want to talk about React components. You know, what is React? What are components? So why are we here? What's different about React components when you use hooks? So that'll lead us to this overview of hooks. And there's three hooks that we'll take a look at in more detail as we go through the webinar. And that's going to be the useState hook, useEffect, and useContext hook. Now, there's a bunch of other hooks, and towards the end, depending on how much time we have, we may be able to take a look at a couple of the other ones, but we should at least be able to go through the list and show you what other types of hooks are available. Okay, so let's get started. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I'm going to be bringing up an example application, and the code for that example application is going to be available. Let me go to the chat and pop the link for that in there. Also, this presentation that you're looking at, you can follow along with. That's available if you go to the handouts section of the GoToWebinar. Okay, give me 1 second. Copy, paste. Okay, so you should have the link in there now if you want to get the example app. I would say wait until a little bit later, and don't try to get it set up while we're going through the webinar, because you'll miss out. But before the end of the webinar, it's a good time to grab that link so you can get a copy of it. It's in a zip file with the React application inside of it. Okay. Okay, so the first thing we would want to just talk about is React, right? I assume that the folks on this webinar are here because they're either working with React, are going to work with React, have a background in JavaScript development and JavaScript frameworks, and are interested in this feature that they've added not so long ago to React, okay, which is the hooks feature. Okay. This is just some information about the React. If you want to go to the React site, you want to download React, all that information will be up at that site. That's for those of you who haven't worked too much with it. I always suggest going through the getting started areas on these development sites. It's always a good place to start if you haven't done that already. Okay. In React is a framework, or some people don't really call it a framework, for the reason that what React does is helps you create components. But to create a whole application, you need to have components, you need to glue the components together, you need to populate the components with data, you need to route between different components when you're setting up different pages. So there's a lot of different things that you need to do. So a proper framework, if you're going to call something that, would include all those pieces. What React is more like a very focused library that's usable for creating components. And then there's a lot of suggestions in the React community about how to fill out the rest of what would be in a framework with other functionalities. Okay. So for React, the core of it is to create a component that can be used in a web application. Okay. These components can be created with either functions or classes. So they're created in JavaScript, okay, but there's two different ways to create them. Well, at least two different ways, two major ways, okay? And usually people will gravitate towards one or the other of these, creating these components using functions because they're more familiar with functions and the way that JavaScript functions work. Or if they maybe come from another language and they're used to using classes, they might gravitate towards that. That being said, when React first started, or even not too long ago, there were capabilities that you could add to your React components when you created them as classes that you couldn't add when you created components as functions. Okay, so in that case, some people were kind of forced to, if they like to use functions and they needed to do certain types of things within React, they were forced to use classes. Okay, what this hooks feature does is allows you to do almost all the same things with JavaScript functions in creating components as you could with classes. Okay, so it kind of levels the playing field, lets you choose to use functions to create your components in more cases. Okay, okay, so so we'll go over here just some of the things that were holding back functional components. Okay, functional components, it just means a component that's created using a JavaScript function as opposed to a class-based component. Okay, okay. So functional components, they're simple functions. Usually they have, just a little code and a return statement. And the return statement returns JSX code. Okay, for those of you who haven't worked with React, JSX code is kind of like allowing you to create HTML inside of your JavaScript. Okay, so that's how you create your format for your component. Okay. Class-based components, okay, can do some other things that functional components couldn't do. Class-based components could handle their own state. Okay, state has to do with the data that's being displayed in a component. And there's different types of data. If you have a list of items, then obviously that's data, right? If you have a paragraph of text, that's data. But there's also other types of state data behind a component, like when you select an item, the information about which item is selected, that's a piece of data. Okay, so there's a bunch of types of data. Okay, and each of those types of data is added to something called a state object, and then can be accessed from there. Okay, with a class-based component, that state object can be internal to the component itself, can be held, and in some cases that's a benefit. Okay, in other cases, what's happening is you're passing state down into a component. Okay, so when you instantiate a component, you're actually passing, in the HTML, you're passing the data into the component from there, and that then shows up as props or properties inside the component. Okay, so that's where functional components typically get their state, from props. Okay, some of the other things that class-based components can do, so they can fetch data. Okay, subscribe to updates, modify the DOM, which is the document object model, after the fact. Okay, because remember, creating a component in React is all about React taking over that function of modifying the DOM. But in some cases, you need to, it's kind of like you don't cook the meal, but you season it with salt and pepper or something. So sometimes you modify the DOM after the fact, and you need to do that in your components. So class-based components had certain types of functions that you could run that could do that. Okay, executing log statements. There's a bunch of these different things that you want to run after the main component is rendered. Okay, and those things were easier to do, or there was capabilities in class-based components to do those. Okay, that's what hooks are going to allow us to do. Some of those types of things, to hold state inside of a functional component, and to do some of these, implement some of these features that are listed here, also inside of functional components. Okay, so those are the capabilities we're talking about here. Hooks add these capabilities to these components, maintaining state, running code after the component renders. Okay, so we'll take a look now at these different hooks. Okay, um, that can be used. useState, useEffect, useContext. So these are methods that are part of React. Okay, that if you use them inside of a functional component, they work in a certain way and they mean a certain thing. Okay? And we'll try to uncover how they're used. Okay, so this is something we'll come back to. There are some rules about when you can use those functions. Those will make more sense after we've actually taken a look at the function, so we'll come back to this. Okay? But let's take a look at a functional component, um, just a standard functional component, right? One that is not using hooks, doesn't need hooks, right? So how does it work? We have this one function here called message1, okay? Message1 in this case is a functional component. You see that it's returning this code here, and this code looks like HTML, right? Well, it's actually JSX code, okay, which can include HTML, and it gets converted automatically for you to the correct JavaScript. Okay, so that's done in the background. So you just have to write this HTML code with some special syntax to create your component. So when you call message1, or when React calls message1, it passes in a properties object, or what's called props object. Okay, and that props object then has data on it, or state data, that can be used inside of the component. So here, the component that we're creating has a div, it has an h1, it says message component, and then it has some CSS rules under classes, okay? And then it outputs this data, props.msg, okay? So question is, where is it getting props.msg? Okay, well, it's getting props because props is being passed in when React calls this function, okay? When does React call this function? Well, when it sees the parent component, which is this one here, the parent component uses the message1 component. So in order to resolve what this is here, this message1, okay, React knows that it needs to find the message1 component and run it, okay, and it runs it with some properties. The properties that it runs or passes in there include whatever's passed in here. Okay, so if I say message msg equals some data, okay, then message is going to be added as a property to the props object. Okay, so that gets passed into message1, and I can use it down here. So that's how state is handled in most um, just standard functional components. Okay, and this is a good time to just get used to the example application. So let's do this here. We're down there. Okay, so here's the example application. And like I said, in the chat, you'll see that there's a link to download the zip file that includes this. Okay, now of course, we don't include node modules. You have to run npm install to add that in, because it just makes it too big. Okay, but other than that, you have your source directory here, and this application has a bunch of different examples in it. If we take a look at the actual application, it looks like this, and we can click on the props component, okay, and see the example over here. So over here is navigation, okay, and then over here we're actually outputting the component. Okay. So how are we doing that? Okay, so let's take a look for the props example. If I go to app.js, okay, there's a lot of stuff in app.js, which is your main JavaScript file when you're creating React applications. Also, there's navigation links and things like that. So when I click on a navigation link, it goes and navigates to a specific route, and that's where the component is brought up. So the props component will be brought up here with this is the message passed in as a property. Okay. So let's go to the props component. All of our components in this particular application are under the examples directory. So we can find props component. Okay. And this is what we expect. We have props component. Props gets passed in when React calls this, and then it uses it down here, props.message. Okay, so that's what you'll see in the example. So we want to move on from there to say, how are we going to get state if we're not using props, right? If we want to actually embed the state within the component. Okay, so let's take a look. First, down here, we're going to use something called the useState hook. Okay. Now, to set up for you to use this hook, you have to import it. So at the top of the file where you're going to be using this, so at the top of the component file, okay, you're going to not only import React, which was already being imported, okay, if you're creating a React component, then you're also importing useState. Okay, useState is a method. Okay, you're going to call it like this. useState, you're going to pass in an initial value, okay, and it's going to return you to what are kind of like handles to this state. Okay, message is going to be a variable that you can use to access the data in that's been passed in. So message is going to resolve to message text quote, right? Set message is going to allow you to actually change the value of the message. Okay. So you'll be able to run set message, give it a new value, and whenever you do that, React is going to know that it needs to re-render the component, okay, with the new state. Okay, so those are the things you need to set it up. So this part here goes at the top of the component. This goes into the function. So you have a functional component. This goes into the functional component before the return statement. Okay, so we'll see an example of that. Okay, so here's an example, a message component. Okay, so this is where your parent component, or in this case, we just, by parent, we don't mean in an object-oriented sense, we just mean in an HTML sense. You have one component that holds or is displaying the other component. Okay, so it's the parent to the other one. So we're saying we want to display the message2 component. Message2 is down here. Okay, but you notice here, we're not passing any data in. Okay, so how's it going to get its message? We could hard code it, okay, or we could do something else, which is what we're going to do here. And you see message2 has this statement here. It's useState sets the data to message A, okay, which can then be accessed via the message variable. Set message is a variable also, but it's a variable that represents a function. Okay, we're not using that in this example, but if you wanted to change the message, then from somewhere in your code, you could run set message and have it change. And we'll see some examples of those also. Okay, but for now, we just see that this is message. It's not props.message. It's actually just message because the state is being held inside of the component. Okay, not passed in. Okay, so let's take a look at an example, a slightly different example of this same thing. Okay, and that's going to be in the useState component. Okay. Let me just see, I want to do that. And then I want to hide the terminal. I think that's supposed to be Shift Control. Okay, we'll worry about that later. Okay, so here is the useState component. Okay, our application is going to show this. Let's take a look at the user interface. Okay, useState. That brings up that component. It has some kind of header, and then it has this thing message, you clicked so many times. So this is the message that we're outputting. But in this case, we're actually going to change some data by clicking. Every time we click, we're going to increase the value of a variable, okay, that's being held as state, and that's going to then show up in the message. Okay. So how does that work? Well, to do that, we need to set up a variable that can be changed. That's going to be this count variable. And the way we do that is we run useState, and we pass it a default value of 0. So when we first start the page, it's going to be 0. Okay, and that's going to be assigned to count. If I want to modify count, I'm going to call setCount. Okay, so here is the code. Here's useState example. That's just your header. Okay, then we have the message here. So most of this message is hard-coded. You clicked, and then but count, we're actually outputting the count variable, okay, which came from useState. Okay, but in addition to that, we have a button where we're setting the on click of the button to be this arrow function. Okay, set count. So we're going to run set count and add 1 to the current count. So if the count is 0, it's going to be 1. If it's 1, it's going to be 2. Okay, so we click on it like that. So if you know, or if you've been working with React, you know that it's usually not enough just to say that you're changing the value of something, okay? Because there needs to be another step involved with React, which is a re-render. So you can change something, but nothing is going to change on the screen until you tell React to re-render that component. Okay, and React has intelligent ways of figuring out which components need to be re-rendered and which ones don't. So that's a big feature of React. But at the very least, it needs to know that you need to re-render. That's actually built into this set count. Okay, remember we got set count by running useState. So set count is a special method. It doesn't just set the value of count, it also calls for this re-render. And that's what we're seeing when we go here. Okay, so we click on it, it sets the value of count, asks React to re-render, React re-renders, and now count is 7. So this time it displays 7. Okay, so that's the order in which things are happening there. Okay, so in this case we're using count and set count. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the other things we can do with useState. Okay, now count, in that example, we were just setting a single variable. Okay, but you know, there's a lot of cases where you need to set multiple variables, okay? And that's what this example is going to show. So this example has an array of some data that's going to be output. Okay, then it's going to have a username. Okay, so we're going to use the useState method more than once. Here we're going to use useState to create us a user and a set user, like you see here. Here we're going to use useState to create us a messages array and a set messages function, which we can update the array. Okay. Remember, when you go into one of these functions, there's going to be a value for these things as it comes up. So the useState here is setting the value of messages, okay, to the value of this messages array up here. That's for the initial time that message list is run. After that, message list is going to, this useState is not going to apply the default. It's going to look at the state that's being held behind the scenes, okay? And that's what happened with count, right? The second time it went through and we did useState for count, it ignores the default and it goes to its hidden value that it's holding, which is the state for the count variable. Okay? And it's going to do the same thing here with user and with messages. It's going to start out with certain values, but it's going to allow those to be changed. So every time we go through this, messages is an array and it has a value. So we can do this. And this is how you implement lists or show lists on the screen in React. You do a map. Usually there's an array. Arrays in JavaScript have map functions. Map functions can be used to create JSX code. So what we're doing here is we're creating a bunch of list items, one for each item in the array. Okay, and that's going to come back as this list HTML. Now, list HTML does not have to be held as state. Okay, it can be just kind of like a temporary variable that's used, okay, as you execute this message list one. Okay, it'll get recreated each time message list one is called, and it's going to be recreated with whatever the current value of the messages array is. Okay, so that's just setup. Okay, so we've set up some variables, and now we're going to output them. Okay, so we see here we're going to output an h1 tag where it says message1 list 4, and we're going to pass out the user. And then in the next thing, we're going to have a div that's going to include the list. Okay, and this list is the one that we just rendered or created up here. Okay, so that should explain what we're doing here. Let's go to here. So when we go to useState mult, okay, which is this example, we have message list one for Joe, because Joe was the name that was set for user. Okay, and then here's the list. Now, we don't have the code in this example that goes and modifies these, but you could add buttons here and then modify and use these methods, set user and set messages, to modify those and ask for a re-render of the component. Okay. Let's take a look at our next example here. Okay, so useState can be used with objects. Okay, so we saw it being used with an array in the previous example, which is the messages array. And here we're actually putting in some data as an object. So here, objects always start and end, at least an object literal starts and ends with a curly bracket, and then it has name value pairs. Okay, so user, the user is Joe, messages, okay, is being set to this messages array here. Okay, so that's the initial data. Okay, so in this case, it just works the same way as when we worked with regular single variables. We use useState, we pass in the initial value. The initial value has to be of the same shape as what we're trying to set. So if we're setting a data object with user and messages, then the initial data needs to reflect that. Okay, and then so we have data that we can reference. So data.user is going to be Joe, and data.messages is going to be that array. We also have set data, so if we wanted to update either of those, okay, we could do that. But remember, when you use set data in this case, you would have to pass in an entirely new object with both user and messages in order to set that. Okay, so some things about using an object make things simpler, and other things like updating it is maybe a little bit more complex. Okay, so in this case, when we're creating our list that's going to go on the screen, this is our JSX of the list items. We do data.messages, okay, because data is an object and messages is the property. Okay? And then when we output the user, Joe, we're using data.user. Okay, so that's using it with objects. So what I want to do is make sure that we get through the next couple slides, and then which are going to talk about the other two main hooks. And then we'll kind of open things up for some questions. Okay, so the useEffect hook. So we've talked about using state. Using state is giving us the ability to hold state inside of our functional component. Okay, so we don't have to pass it in from the parent. Okay, that's what we're getting from that. What useEffect does it allows us to insert code into the life cycle or a specific part of the component's life cycle, which is the component's life cycle is um, React sees that the component needs to be created. It runs the function, okay, which creates an image. Okay, it then does a diff with the existing DOM, decides what needs to be updated, updates it, and then there's a time right after that, after the DOM has been updated, where you might want to run some other code. Okay, so that's what useEffect does. useEffect allows us to register um, a callback type function that's going to be called at that point in time after after the initial DOM render. Okay. Okay. So here's just some information about the useEffect hook, right? useEffect takes a function, that's what you pass into it. Okay. That function is called after the DOM has been updated by React. Okay. And in most cases, my effect, which is the function you're passing in, is passed in as like an arrow function or an inline function. Okay. You could make it a separate function and then pass that function name in. That's also possible. Okay. It's going to be called after the renders. Okay. And that means even after the initial render. The initial render is the first time that, just say you open up a new page and it renders a list for the first time. That's the initial render. All the other renders after that work a little bit differently behind the scenes because React is usually just modifying certain parts of the component, not the whole component. Okay. Okay. You can also use this useEffect multiple times, just like we could with useState, right? Well, let's take a look here. So we have this component, you click, it's going to do something similar to what we saw in that last useState example. You click and it's going to update this value here. You click 0, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. Okay, but how's it going to do it? It's going to work a little bit differently here. So you have count. Okay, you're using useState to hold count as a local variable. It's a variable inside of the function that changes value. So when you call the function once, it has one value, but if you increment it, it could have a different value the next time you call the same function. Then you have useEffect. Okay, so here you are registering this function. Here is an arrow function. So it's useEffect, and then the arrow function starts. It's a little bit hard to do that, but it's like basically here. Okay. And what this is going to do is update this message to you clicked so many times, count times. Okay. And then in the button, we're going to do the same thing we did before, which was set the count, just increase the count value. Okay. So the difference here is that the message gets updated at a different point in time. Okay. The message is getting updated after the render. So if you were to actually look at the or slow down the rendering, you would see that initially, after you click on the button, the component gets rendered with the same value it just had. Okay, but then right after that, this kicks in, and the message is changed, and it updates the message value on the screen. Okay, so usually that's happening too fast for you to see. Okay, so we useEffect. Here's an example which we'll look at the code of this, where we're going to use useEffect in a different way. So let me just see if this one's the same here. No, that's just updating the CSS rules. Yeah, I'll need to take a look at the code of that. Okay, but that's what useEffect is doing. It's allowing you to make changes at that point in time after the render. In this case, you're doing something you could do in a different way with useState, so it's not as dramatic. Okay. One of the other things that is common to do in useEffect is to load data. Okay. So remember, what you're going to do here is it will allow the the um, the component to be rendered. Then you call this function that's going to load data. When the data comes back, it's going to run a set function, which will cause another render to happen, okay, with the new data. Okay. So here's a message list 3, just another version of message list application. Okay. And we're going to do useState, and we're just going to have a default message. And let's see, what's the difference here? So this, it's going to come up with just a message, not, oh, here's an array. So it is an array, but it only has one item in it, default message. Okay, so that's what it starts with. Okay, so if you could, again, slow things down, that's the first thing you're going to see rendered, just default message as one item in the list. Okay, but then it's going to run what you're registering here in useEffect. Okay, get message list. Okay, dot then. So you've got some function here, get message list, which is an asynchronous function that returns a promise. Okay, so it's just, which is typical of functions that call to get network resources. So if you make an HTTP call, it's going to return a promise. So that's basically what this is doing. So get message list is going up to a RESTful server, getting a list. And then it's assigning the list, okay, by calling set message list, okay, and passing the list in. Okay. So what does set message list do? Well, it sets the message list variable, but then it also calls for a re-render. Okay, and the re-render then includes the updated list. Okay, so here's some full code for that. So let's take a look here. Here's your get message list. This is your function that retrieves the data, and you see it creates a promise, and it returns the promise. Okay. In this case, we're just faking it out. We're not actually making a network call. We're just making a delayed call. Okay, so we're calling this, it's getting the message list and passing it back half a second later. And so that's like simulating a call, right? But it brings back a promise, so our code here won't know the difference, right? So when our code runs get message list, it has no idea whether the data was local or whether the data was returned from a network source. It just knows it gets a promise, okay, and sets the message list. Okay, we're displaying the list the same way we did in the previous app by doing a map of the message list array, okay, which gives us some list items, which will be displayed down here. Okay, so class name contents, unordered list, and then we have our list items down here. Okay, so that's what this example is going to do. And the idea is that it's not returning data that's hard-coded. This is the way that you would return data if you're retrieving it from a network source. Okay. Now, one thing that you need to do, because think about this, if you're calling this useEffect every time it renders, this could be called a lot, okay? And in fact, it could be called a lot when the data is not changing, okay? It could, because the re-render could be happening for other reasons, right? So there's a second parameter to our useEffect call. The first parameter was just to pass in the function that we want to have called when rendering is done. The DOM render is done, it runs this. Okay. The second thing which is typical when you're retrieving arrays, is to send an empty array. Okay. Now, when you do this, it avoids having an infinite loop. Okay. Okay. So it checks to see whatever the value of the array is and makes sure that it's different than what it was. Okay, so if this hasn't changed, it will not call your code. Okay, so you'll find this out the first time you try to use the useEffect to retrieve data, and then you look in your JavaScript console and it just keeps on rolling through and doing the same thing over and over. Okay, so that's, just go back here and make sure you put in this this parameter as your second parameter. Okay, and so let's take a look at that code, or actually let's take a look at the here. Okay, so useEffect, this is that example, and we'll go back here, useEffect. Okay, so again, we've got this, let's see, useEffect, it's calling get articles, and get articles is this here. And in this case, get articles is actually doing a fetch, which is an actual network call, but it's, in this case, it's retrieving articles.json from the same server that is serving up this React application. Okay, so you don't have to worry about proxies and stuff. It's really just pulling it from articles.json should be in public articles.json. So this is what it's pulling. In React, in your React application, anything that you want to serve right from the server as a static resource gets put into the public directory. Okay, it's the same thing for the index.html. That's where it gets that from. Okay, so pulling articles.json from there, and let's go back to useEffect. Okay, so and this is the way you do fetch, and then this brings back the response object, which then brings back the response.json object. Okay, and you do set articles. Okay, where do you get set articles from? Okay, set articles is one of these special functions you get when you do useState, right? useState for the initial articles. You get the articles, which allows you to reference the articles, which is this list, or set articles to update it. Okay. So when are you running this? You're running it inside of useEffect. Okay, so useEffect. Okay, the first parameter is this arrow function, get articles, and the second parameter is that special parameter, which makes sure it doesn't get into an infinite loop situation. Okay. Okay, so let's see what the second one was. So we have useEffect 2, which looks a little different. What we're doing here, if I click on it, you see that we're doing some DOM manipulation, or we're changing the background color. It's just an easy way to show that we can modify the DOM. Okay, so let's look at that code. And that's in useEffect component 2. Okay, so let's go down here. This is our return statement. Okay, our return statement is just going to have the list. It's going to map the articles and output them. Okay, so what's going to change? Okay, well, we're going to have a useEffect up here, but the useEffect here is going to set an event listener on the body of the document, so that when I click on it, it calls this body list handler. Okay, and the body click handler changes the background color. It actually gets a reference to the document body. Okay, so this is typical DOM code. Get the reference, you do reference.style.background color, and you explicitly set the background color. If it's light gray, you set it, you unset it. If it isn't like, so you're just changing it, it's toggling it. Okay. Okay, if it's light gray, it sets it to blank. If it's blank, it sets it to light gray. Okay, so that's being called there. So when you click on it, that's what's going to happen. And then useEffect, let's see. So that method's also going to return this setup. Okay, so when you return something from a useEffect callback, what you're doing is you're giving a function, okay, that can be used to set things back to normal. Okay, so in this case, we're removing the event listener. Okay, so this is a function. If you get a copy of this, like when you call useEffect, if you want to stop what's happening in useEffect, you can then call this function that gets returned. Okay, but for now, we're not worrying about that. But we do see this here, useEffect. We've got our empty brackets here because we want to make sure that this doesn't get run in a loop. Okay, and the last thing we want to take a look at here, let's say use context. Okay, use context. Okay, what's going to happen here is we're just getting data from a different location. Okay, it's not getting the information from props. It's setting a context, which is something you can do in React. And it's something that you do when you want to retrieve data, but you want to retrieve data several levels of hierarchy down into the components. Okay. Normally, that would require you to pass that data down into each set of props, okay, which gets kind of messy. So in this case, you create a context, and then you go down, and somewhere inside of your most nested component, you grab the context and get the data straight from there. And that's how this list is going to be defined. Okay. Let's take a look right at that example. Use context. Okay. So we start off at the top of this component, okay, by creating the user context. Okay, the user context is really just an object that holds data. Okay, so we're going to hold the articles there in this use context. Okay, then we're going to create this function, the use context component, which is going to bring us back this information. Okay, some JSX that holds the content. Okay, but you notice we're not passing any data into this. We're not passing this user context into it. Okay, we'll see that down here. Okay, when content is rendered, React is going to run the content function. Okay, and even though we're passing in props, it's not going to use them. It's going to use this use context. Okay, you're going to pass the user context that was created up above, okay? And that's going to create the CTX object, which gives you direct access to any data that was in the context. Okay, and it doesn't make a difference how many levels deep into the hierarchy you are. Okay, it'll still give you access to that context data. In this case, our context data has articles on it, so ctx.articles will always then allow you to access the articles. Okay, so let's see. Well, this stuff takes longer than I expect. That's most of what we wanted to go over for these three. Let's just go down here. Now, what I want to do is show you that there are a bunch of other examples in this. If you've gotten a copy of this here, of the materials that go along with the webinar, you'll see that there's additional examples. Use reducer, okay, which allows you, if you're using some kind of a state management library like Redux, you can call a reducer from inside of your functional component. Use callback, use memo. There's all different use cases for these things, and they're then explained here. And for most of them, in the example application, you'll also find examples of them. Okay. So WebAge Solutions, a great training company. I do training for them. I write training material for them. And they have a bunch of courses on React. There's these two, and I think there's some more that have just been created. If you're interested, okay, in what they have, definitely go up to the site, WebAge Solutions, okay, and here's some of the contact information for them. Of course, you'll be able to see contact information on the site as well. Okay, so I encourage you to go up there. That's also where you're going to find the webinar recordings. So if you go up there today, you'll find webinar recordings for previous webinars. For example, I did one not too long ago on using TypeScript in React. So that's up there. You'll be able to get that right away. And then this one will be available as soon as they process the video and upload it. Okay. So that's going to be it. I'd like to say thank you for attending. Okay. Certainly take advantage of these contacts and give them a call if you have any questions about um, what's available. And there are, there's free resources on the WebH site, like previous webinars and other like blog articles about React and about other technologies. So it's just a good site to check out. So I encourage you to do that. And that'll be it for today. Again, thanks for attending and good luck with your development.